The courtroom was alive with the usual hum of anticipation, lawyers rustling papers, spectators whispering in hushed tones, and the distant sound of a gavel striking in another chamber. Judge Eleanor Hayes sat at the bench, her gaze steady and professional. It was another day. Another case, at least. That's what she thought the bailiff called the case, the state of Louisiana versus James Anderson. Eleanor shifted slightly in her seat, her hands resting on the polished oak of the bench. She glanced at the ERS in front of her assault robbery resisting arrest. A familiar ache of disappointment settled in her chest. Another lost soul. Tangled in the system, she thought, when the defendant was brought in her world, tilted the man standing before her. Shackled at the wrists and ankles was not a stranger. He was James Anderson. Her, James. Her throat tightened as a flood of memories surged forward the summer afternoons they spent racing bicycles down the dusty streets of Hammond, Louisiana. The late-night talks under the magnolia tree in her backyard, the promises they made as kids, to always have each other's backs no matter what. But the man standing before her wasn't the boy she remembered. His shoulders were hunched, his face lined with years of hardship, yet his eyes, those deep, soulful eyes, were unmistakable. Eleanor's grip on the gavel faltered for the first time in her career. She hesitated. The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in as she tried to process the impossible. James looked up, his expression a mixture of shock and resignation. Recognition flickered in his eyes, but he quickly looked away, his head bowing slightly. The courtroom waited. Eleanor forced herself to speak. "Mr. Anderson, you stand accused of assault and robbery. How do you plead?" James's voice was rough, almost unrecognizable. "Not guilty, Your Honor." Her heart pounded. She wanted to stop everything to demand answers. What had happened to him? How had their paths diverged so drastically? But her role as a judge demanded composure proceed. She said, her voice steadier than she felt as the prosecutor began their opening statements. Eleanor's mind raced. This wasn't just any case, this was James, and somehow she had to figure out how to separate her past from her present before it was too late. The courtroom blurred as Eleanor's mind drifted to a time long before her black robes and the gavel in her hand. She and James had grown up on opposite sides of Hammond, Louisiana, divided not by distance, but by the unspoken rules of their segregated town. Her family's house was a modest one-story with a white picket fence, while James's family lived in a weathered home at the end of a dirt road surrounded by fields. Their friendship had been an anomaly. She remembered how they met, an accidental encounter at the edge of a creek, where she had wandered too far from her own backyard. James had been fishing his line, tangled in the reeds. She'd offered to help. And that simple gesture had turned into years of secret adventures and shared dreams. Eleanor, he had once said, lying on the grass beside her under the stars, "You ever think about leaving this place, like really getting out, going somewhere? People don't look at us funny just for sitting together." She had laughed, then brushing off the idea. But James wasn't joking. Even as a child, he saw the world for what it was, a place that didn't always make room for people like him. Their bond deepened despite the whispers, the sideways glances and the outright disapproval from both sides. But the pressure was always there, like a weight neither of them could shake. And then one day it all ended. It was the summer before high school, when Eleanor's father caught them sitting on the porch together. His voice had been cold, sharp, with authority. "Eleanor, get inside now." She'd hesitated, glancing at James, who stood frozen in place. "Go on," he had said quietly, his voice tinged with resignation. "I'll see you around," but they hadn't seen each other again. Not really. Her father forbade her from going near James, and soon after James's family moved away, Eleanor threw herself into school, her ambitions carrying her far beyond the town of Hammond. She went to law school chasing dreams of justice and fairness, but she never forgot the boy who had taught her what courage looked like now. Sitting on the bench, she wondered what had become of James after she'd walked into that house and closed the door on their friendship. His record showed a series of arrests for minor offenses, petty theft, loitering, nothing that screamed a violent nature. But then again, How much of someone's life could you see in a few lines on a rap sheet? The prosecutor's voice snapped her back to the present. He was describing the alleged crime. James was accused of assaulting a store clerk during a robbery at a convenience store in Baton Rouge. The clerk had suffered minor injuries, and the cash register had been emptied. James was picked up a few blocks away, the cash allegedly still in his possession. Eleanor studied James as the prosecutor spoke. His posture was slouched, his hands clasped in front of him, but his expression was unreadable. Did he really do it? Or was there more to the story than what the prosecution claimed? The courtroom adjourned for a lunch break, giving Elor a moment to gather her thoughts. As she returned to her chambers, her assistant, Margaret, approached with a hesitant expression. "Judge Hayes, are you okay? You seemed a little distracted," Margaret asked Elana. Hesitated. Should she confide in Margaret, would it be unprofessional to admit that she knew the defendant? Instead, she shook her head. "I'm fine, just a lot on my mind." But she wasn't fine. How could she be when the past she'd buried so deeply was sitting just a few feet away, waiting for her judgment? The courtroom was packed when the trial resumed. Reporters scribbled notes. The clerk shuffled papers, and the prosecutor, a sharp, fat man named Richard Powell, was ready to deliver his case. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury." Powell began, his voice firm. "This case is about violence. It's about a man who walked into a convenience store and without provocation attacked an innocent clerk before stealing the cash register contents. The evidence will show that James Anderson is guilty of this crime." Eleanor felt a knot tighten in her stomach. The prosecutor's tone was clinical, detached, as if James were nothing more than a name on a docket. She glanced at James, whose gaze remained fixed on the table before him. The defense attorney, Lisa Porter, rose to present her opening statement. She was young but confident, with a voice that carried across the room. The prosecution would have, "You believe this case is straightforward, but it's not my client. James Anderson has maintained his innocence from the start. We will show that there is more to this story, and that assumptions made on the night of the arrest do not hold up under scrutiny." The first witness was called to the stand. A store clerk who had been working on the night of the incident. He described seeing a man fitting James's description enter the store, argue with the cashier, and then lunge over the counter. His testimony was detailed, but something about it felt rehearsed. Lee's cross-examination was surgical. "Mr. Chambers, you stated that the man who attacked the clerk was wearing a red hoodie, is that correct?" "Yes," the witness replied. "Did you see his face clearly?" "Not really. It was dark, and he had the hood up." Lisa nodded, pacing slightly. "So, you're saying you couldn't definitively identify the individual who committed the assault? Well, no, but no further questions," Lisa said, cutting him off. Eleanor noticed James shift slightly in his seat, his shoulders squaring as if the exchange had given him a small glimmer of hope. The next piece of evidence was a surveillance video from the store. The footage was grainy and poorly lit, showing a figure in a red hoodie entering the store. The prosecution argued that the person in the video was James, but the quality made it difficult to discern any identifying features as the video played. Eleanor studied it intently. Could this truly be James? The figure moved quickly, grabbing at the counter before disappearing off screen. The footage ended abruptly, leaving an unsettling gap in the narrative. James's defense was based on an alibi. He claimed he had been walking home from a friend's house at the time of the robbery. The friend, however, was unwilling to testify, citing fear of retaliation from the community. Lisa argued that the lack of a willing witness didn't negate James's innocence, but the jury's expressions hinted at skepticism as the trial wore on. Eleanor felt the weight of her position pressing down on her. She was meant to be impartial, a pillar of fairness. But how could she be when every moment reminded her of their childhood? The boy who had once been her closest friend was now a man fighting for his freedom. and she was the one tasked with determining his fate when the court adjourned for the day. Eleanor lingered at the bench, her fingers tracing the edges of the gavel. She wanted to talk to James, to ask him directly what had happened, but she knew she couldn't. Any contact outside the courtroom would jeopardize the case and her career, as she watched James being escorted out of the room in shackles. Eleanor's resolve wavered. She had always believed in the justice system, in its ability to reveal the truth. But for the first time, she wondered if the truth was something it could ever truly grasp. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as the trial reached a pivotal moment. It was the defense's turn to present their case, and Lisa Porter called her first key witness officer, Daniel Harris. The arresting officer, Eleanor, leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing. This was where the cracks, if any, might begin to show. Officer Harris, a burly man with a gruff demeanor, took the stand. Lisa approached him with deliberate calm. "Officer Harris," she began, "you were the one who apprehended my client, correct?" "That's right," he replied, his tone clipped. "You stated in your report that Mr. Anderson was walking 2 blocks from the scene of the robbery when you detained him, is that correct?" "Yes. And what led you to believe he was the suspect?" Harris shifted in his seat. He matched the description, a black male, mid-40s wearing. Lisa's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Dark clothing?" But the suspect in the video was described as wearing a red hoodie. "Did you find a red hoodie in Mr. Anderson's possession when you searched him?" Harris hesitated. "No, but he could have discarded it." Lisa stepped closer. "Could have. Did you or any other officer search the surrounding area for this so-called hoodie?" Harris's jaw tightened. "Number, we didn't have time. He was apprehended quickly." Lisa pressed further. "So just to be clear, you arrested my client based on a vague description, with no physical evidence linking him to the scene?" The silence from the officer said more than words. Eleanor glanced at the jury. A few members exchanged uncertain looks. Lisa wasn't finished. "Officer Harris, do you remember if Mr. Anderson said anything during his arrest?" "He protested, said he was innocent." "And did you make any effort to investigate that claim, or did you just assume he was guilty based on how he looked?" Harris's face reddened. "I followed protocol." "Protocol," Lisa repeated, her voice edged with skepticism. "No further questions, Your Honor." A low murmur spread through the courtroom as Harris stepped down, his credibility clearly shaken. Lanark's heart pounded. This was more than a trial now. It felt like a reckoning. Not just for James, but for a system too quick to judge. Then the defense made an unexpected move. Lisa called an expert witness, a forensic analyst who had reviewed the surveillance footage. The analyst testified that based on the height and build of the person in the video, it wasn't possible to definitively identify them as James. Even more troubling, the timestamp on the footage had been altered, casting serious doubt on its authenticity. The prosecutor dismissed the analysis as speculation, but the jury seemed visibly disturbed. A shadow of doubt settled over the room, and Eleanor felt the weight of it. As the day came to an end, James was allowed to testify. Lisa had warned him about the risks, but he insisted. Chains softly clinking, he walked to the stand. His voice was quiet, but full of raw emotion. "I've made mistakes in my life," James began, looking directly at the jury. "I've gone down the wrong paths, trusted the wrong people, but I didn't do this. That night, I was just walking home. The cops stopped me. No questions, they just assumed I was guilty." His voice cracked. "I've been fighting my whole life, fighting to be seen as more than just what people assume about me. But this... I'm tired. I just want the truth to matter." Eleanor's throat tightened. James sat back down, his words lingering in the air, a plea not just for justice, but for humanity. Eleanor glanced at the jury. Their faces reflected a mix of emotions: doubt, empathy, uncertainty. This was it. The truth was no longer just about evidence or testimonies. It had become a battle of conscience, a fight against prejudice and assumption. Eleanor understood her role wasn't merely to uphold the law. It was to interpret it in a way that served true justice. The final day of the trial arrived, heavy with anticipation. Closing arguments were delivered with precision. The prosecutor leaned on the circumstantial evidence, urging the jury to place their trust in the system. Lisa, in contrast, implored them to look deeper, to recognize the flaws in the case and the humanity of the man they were judging. Eleanor listened, her face composed, but her thoughts racing. She knew her position was clear. She couldn't influence the jury, but if their verdict left room for interpretation, she would have the final say. The burden of justice weighed heavily on her shoulders. The jury deliberated for hours. The courtroom emptied and refilled as people stretched, whispered, and waited. James sat silently, hands tightly clasped. He hadn't looked at Eleanor since the first day of the trial, and she didn't blame him. What could she possibly say that would make any of this right? Finally, the bailiff announced that a verdict had been reached. The room fell into a tense silence as the foreperson stood, holding the verdict slip, hands trembling. "In the case of the state of Louisiana versus James Anderson," she read, "we find the defendant—" The pause felt endless. "Not guilty." The room erupted. Gasps, murmurs, even a few cheers. Eleanor tapped her gavel for order. James's shoulders dropped, the weight visibly lifting, though his face revealed little. He had won his freedom, but it was clear this victory had come at a price. Eleanor addressed the courtroom, her voice calm and firm. "The jury has spoken. Mr. Anderson, you are free to go. Court is adjourned." As the room emptied, Eleanor remained at the bench, watching James quietly sign his release paperwork. For a moment, she thought he would leave without saying anything, but then he turned and slowly approached. The courtroom was nearly empty now. A few clerks tidying up, Margaret gathering documents. James stopped a few feet from the bench, his expression cautious. "You don't owe me anything," he said softly. "But I want to know, why didn't you say anything? You knew me." Eleanor's throat tightened. The words caught in her chest. "Because I couldn't," she finally said. "I had to be fair. If I had said something, it could have jeopardized everything." James studied her, his face a mixture of hurt and understanding. "Fair," he repeated quietly. "That's the thing, Eleanor. The world's never been fair, not for people like me." She nodded slowly, her eyes dropping to the polished wood of the bench. "You're right," she admitted. "I wish I'd done more back then. I wish I could have done more now." James sighed, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "We were kids. We didn't know any better. But you know now, don't you?" "I do," Eleanor said firmly. "And I'm sorry." James gave a faint nod, then turned and walked away, his back straight, his steps steady, until he disappeared through the courthouse doors. Eleanor remained alone in the courtroom, the weight of his words pressing down on her. She had upheld the law, but the trial had revealed something deeper. Justice wasn't just about evidence or verdicts. It was about lives shaped by systems far more powerful than any one person. For Eleanor, this was a reckoning, a wake-up call. Her position on the bench wasn't just one of authority. It was a platform for change. As she stepped out of the courtroom that evening, the fading sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps. Eleanor made a silent vow to herself. She couldn't rewrite the past, but she would do everything in her power to ensure the future held more than just hollow promises of fairness. It wouldn't be easy, it might even be impossible, but she owed it to James, and to herself, to try.